I used to think a good life was nothing more than a sequence of small routines done well. Coffee at 6, the dog out, the mail brought in before the heat turned the metal box into a skillet. I pictured a child inside the rhythm. Crayons on the table, a tiny spoon clinking the sides of a cereal bowl, a voice at the edge of sleep asking for a glass of water, and one more story. When we couldn't have that for 7 years, the house grew tidy and sharp, like a room staged for a buyer who never showed up. My wife started keeping her shoes by the door as if the future were a place we could simply go to. If we were quick enough, the clinic arrived like a billboard. You don't remember not being there. One morning, the lot out by the highway was red dirt and seeded weeds. By the next, a clean rectangle of building sat on it. Walls the color of eggshells, glass arranged so that the sky looked cleaner when you glanced through. The sign said, Aurelia Fertility Center, in a font that tried to look scientific and warm at once. There were banners flapping near the entrance, discounts, trials, a photo of a baby with an expression that made me feel both hopeful and stupid. We went on a Wednesday because Wednesdays felt lucky, though we never said so out loud. Inside, the air smelled like citrus and something colder underneath, the way a new refrigerator does when you open it for the first time. A receptionist with a careful ponytail typed our names into a system that knew more than it should. We filled out forms that asked the same questions 3 different ways. A nurse put a cuff around my wife's arm and said numbers that sounded fine. A doctor with calm hands called us into a consultation room where the art was sunsets, and the table was wide enough to make me aware of the scuffs on my shoes. They called it a targeted fertility protocol. The phrase had the heft of a door that shuts by itself. They explained in rounds, as if teaching us to repeat it later. A pre-implantation screening, an adjunct therapy to prepare uterine tissue, a series of supportive infusions timed to specific hormone levels. No part on its own sounded outlandish. Taken together, it felt like standing in the middle of a road while traffic flowed past on both sides, close enough to lift your shirt with their wind. Success rates are high, the doctor said, especially in your cohort. What's our cohort? My wife asked. The doctor's smile sharpened a fraction. Favorable, we signed. Always, there is a moment where the pen touches the line, and a choice becomes an event in the world, tied down by ink. I noted the phrases in the consent form that clung to my eye like burrs. Novel trophic pathways, transient exchange states, environmental borrowing. Each was followed by reassuring parentheses. Each left behind a shadow. The protocol worked on a schedule that threaded our life like new plumbing basal temperatures, morning labs, and ultrasound at exactly 7:10 a.m. because the machine was in use after 8. My wife took the adjunct therapy through an IV whose bag caught sunlight and glowed like something alive. We didn't tell our parents. We told no one. We arrived early to avoid the couples we might have to nod at. The women with their wrists bristling with medic alert bands. The men looking for something to do with their hands. We were kind to the nurses. We memorized the pattern of sealing tiles over the infusion chairs because there are only so many times you can count to 60 by heart. The embryo looked like a cluster of soap bubbles on the screen. The doctor said, "Textbook," in a voice that meant, "Good." There was a moment when we saw a flicker and both leaned toward it as if closing the distance would secure it to us. We went home and lay on the bed like campers in a tent, listening to a storm they've hoped for, and now hearing it aren't sure they want. My wife's pregnancy was the kind people use as evidence in arguments. No nausea worth mentioning, blood pressure that held steady like a metronome, glucose numbers that earned small nods in exam rooms. We both pretended not to be superstitious. We bought nothing. Then the third trimester rolled in like a hum under the floorboards, and with it a sense that we were being watched and graded. The clinic called weekly for check-ins. A different doctor each time asked the same questions with the same warm cadence. Any unusual sensations? Any sensitivities? I wanted to ask them to define unusual, to tell me what kind of normal we were aiming at, but their voices made those questions sound ungrateful. June arrived late spring, when the air in our part of Arkansas tastes like damp wood and the sweet rot of last year's leaves. Labor started in honest twinges in the grocery store while I was staring at a shelf of canned tomatoes, trying to decide between crushed and diced as if it mattered. We drove with the windows down and the radio off. The hospital had its own smell, antiseptic and warm plastic, and a clock that ticked too loudly. My wife gripped the rail and cursed in a low, practical voice. When June came, she didn't make a sound for several seconds that felt like a long hallway. Then she let out a cry that wasn't loud so much as clean. The nurse lifted her to my wife's chest, and I watched them meet. Two faces making the expression people in paintings have when they look at Saint June's eyes were the first thing everyone commented on. "Bright," the pediatrician said, and the way he said it made bright sound like a measurement. She latched without trouble. She slept 2 hours at a time, then 3, then 5, as if she'd read a manual and intended to ace the course. The hospital photographer came by, and June held her gaze with such steady attention that the woman's practiced patter fell apart. We went home stunned by our luck and the fact of it. The dog sniffed June's foot and placed his head on my knee in a gesture that felt like a blessing. The first month passed in a rhythm so ordinary it made me suspicious. Feedings that ticked along on a graph the clinic app applauded. Diapers that turned the exact shade the pamphlet described. We took walks at dusk when the mosquitoes were just a rumor. June watched the way cottonwoods moved and blinked when wind touched her face. She smiled early, not the random gas smile babies give, but something that seemed to land on you the way a hand lands on your shoulder when someone wants you to know you're not alone. I took pictures of everything and made weekly albums labeled by date, like a man indexing proof that Joy had visited. People said she was perfect, and I nodded until the word stopped meaning anything. Perfect compared to what? To who? My wife floated through those months like a person walking in water at just the right temperature. Her face softened in a way that erased years I hadn't realized were there. Sometimes I would find them asleep in the afternoon. June's fingers curled around my wife's thumb, both breathing in a tandem that felt choreographed. I stood in the doorway and did not move, because moving would mean admitting that scenes end. When June was 6 months old, the clinic asked us to bring her in for a routine evaluation. The waiting room had more toys than before, all of them made of wood. The other babies were handsome, too symmetrical in the way catalog children are. Their parents made small talk like people who don't want to make friends because they don't want to imagine explaining later. In exam 3, a nurse we'd never met took blood. With a quick, almost offended motion, June didn't cry. The doctor who came in wore a pin on her lapel, shaped like a leaf. She introduced herself with the confident ease of someone sure you had heard good things about her. "How is our June?" she asked, as if the pronoun could be a bridge. We said fine. She said the numbers looked excellent. When I asked what the numbers were, she printed a chart and slid it across the counter. It showed lines and dots hugging those lines, and that was the whole point. We filled out a 1-year questionnaire when June crossed that line on the calendar. It was thick as a magazine and worded as if an answer could be wrong in a way that would embarrass us. Appetite? Sleep? Number of words used consistently? Does your child exhibit unusual sensitivities? That last one made me pause. How would I phrase the way June watched people? She didn't stare rudely. She regarded. It was as if she were listening with her eyes for a tone people couldn't hear. She did it with old folks, especially with our neighbor, Mrs. Wilkes, when she brought over a pan of cornbread and insisted we return the dishful. With the postal carrier, who left dog biscuits in the box even though we hadn't asked. With my father the first time he came to sit on our couch and announced that the house finally sounded like a house. My father had been old as long as I've known him, the durable kind of old that resists premise and conclusion. He went gray early and then stopped, as if he'd agreed to a summary and saw no need for further detail. He had a farmer's hands and a reader's patience. He held June like he was holding every child he didn't know he'd missed. She sat on his lap that first afternoon for nearly an hour, longer than she sat for anyone, her palms pressed to his, her attention fixed on his face the way a compass fixes. My father told her about the creek he'd fished when he was a boy and the way the air smelled when rain was coming to the fields. June's mouth made a small O, as if tasting the words. When he finally stood to go, his color washed away the way water leaves a glass. "Just tired," he said, smiling, and the smile was there, but thinner. He called the next morning to say he'd slept in, which he never did. "Can't shake the heaviness," he said in a tone meant to illustrate that it wasn't enough to fuss about. I told him to drink a little more water and sit where the light could find him. I told myself he was 82. That heaviness was a season. That afternoon, June crawled to the window and pressed her palm against the glass, leaving a print that matched the size of a leaf. The dog began to avoid June, not dramatically. He simply took the other side of the room when she played on the rug, as if he preferred the cool of the tile. When she reached for him, he accepted the touch and then moved away with the apologetic look dogs have when they think they've let you down. I said nothing because I had made a study of saying nothing where worry wanted a door. Summer deepened. June cut her first teeth with no fever and no midnight crying. She learned to pull herself up on the coffee table and gave me a look that read as pride. Sometimes I woke at night because the house felt occupied by something awake besides us. I would walk the hall and find June in her crib, not crying, not standing, just awake and listening. If I picked her up, she would put her ear to my chest with the seriousness of a specialist and stay like that until my heartbeat, which had been steady forever, settled into an even steadier lane, as if someone had smoothed a hand down its back. We took her to the clinic again at 18 months because the protocol required it. The doctor with the leaf pin was no longer there. A man with perfect hair introduced himself by 2 last names. He reviewed labs I couldn't see and said, "Phenomenal resilience." When I asked if resilience meant health, he said, "Of course," too quickly. On the way out, the receptionist handed me a glossy handout about attachment and energetics, with a photo of a child holding an elderly woman's hand as they sat on a bench in a park that didn't look like any park we had. June's second birthday was pink cupcakes and a banner we hung slightly crooked. My father came again, slower on the steps. He sat with June in the shade of the pecan tree and told her the names of birds. She repeated none and looked pleased anyway. Late in the afternoon, he stood, swayed, and steadied himself with a hand that used to grip post-hole diggers without a tremor. "You okay?" I asked. "Too light." He made a joke about naps and age. I laughed because that's what the line called for. When I hugged him before he left, he felt not thinner, but less, as if somebody had taken out a shelf somewhere inside and the structure held for now on the remaining boards. That night, the one-year questionnaire sat on the table where I'd left it half done. I filled the boxes with my neat block letters because neatness feels like control. Appetite, excellent. Sleep, consistent. Words, ball, dog, mama, thank you. Though thank you came out with a catch. Like a singer looking for the right key, unusual sensitivities. I wrote, enjoys wind on face, quiet during storms, attentive to people. I lifted the pen, wanted to add something about her stillness, about how she pressed her ear to my chest and my father's chest, and the chest of the man at the feed store who had let her pat the shoulder of his denim jacket. I left the line blank because I couldn't find a word that didn't feel like betrayal. We took the form in the next morning. The receptionist with the ponytail turned it over, stamped it, and slid it into a tray labeled Cohort A, Follow-Up. The stamp left a faint, damp mark that smelled like rubber and ink and water. On Sunday, my father called again. Sapped, he said, an old word he had never used like that before. It's not bad, just more than I've felt. He laughed as if to lighten it. Your mother used to say I had energy for 3. Would you let me take you in? I asked. No need. I'll sit a spell. After we hung up, June climbed onto the couch and into my lap as if we'd rehearsed it. She set her ear over my heart and closed her eyes. The tick of it felt louder in my own head than it had ever felt before. A calm came, clean and total, the kind that erases a day's static. She stayed like that for a long minute and then lifted her head. Her eyes were very bright. Thank you, she said, careful with the consonants. For what? I asked, and heard how the question sounded like a challenge. She tilted her head, considering me the way she considered wind, the way she considered breath each winter morning when we opened the door and showed her how our mouths made ghosts. For to warm, she said finally, like it was the simplest thing. I kissed the top of her head and told myself that children say odd, dreamy things, and parents write them down in journals to laugh about later. I told myself that my father had used the word sapped, but also the word fine. I told myself routines could be rebuilt around anything, that the world adjusts to make room for what it's given. That night, the dog slept at the far end of the hall, and when I woke at 3, the house was listening again. June was awake in her crib, eyes open in the dark, calm as a moon. When I lifted her, she placed her small, cool hand against my throat as if measuring the weather there, and then, satisfied, went soft in my arms, her breathing settling into mine like a metronome catching time. I stood a while in the doorway of our room, feeling both full and emptied in a way I didn't have a word for, and watched the outline of my wife sleeping curve around the space June and I had made. In the morning, the phone rang and rang in that old, patient way landlines have. I reached for it already knowing whose voice and what it would say. Though I didn't know why I thought that. "I think I'll stay in bed a bit," my father said, thick-tongued and trying to make it sound like a luxury. "Don't come fussing. I'm just tired." "Okay," I said, because that was the script and because I finally understood that the word miracle is a debt written in elegant ink on good paper. You admire the handwriting. You sign, you fold it into an envelope, and you carry it to the mailbox. And the flag goes up red as a warning. And then one day you look down and realize the letter was addressed to your door. The first thing that didn't add up was small enough to miss. A squirrel lay under the pecan tree one morning, fur smooth, eyes clear, the body arranged as if it had put itself down gently and decided not to start again. No blood, no ants, no sign of having been chased. June crouched beside it with a concentrated courtesy she brought to anything smaller than herself and tapped its shoulder with one finger. "Sleepy," she said. I told her to step back and got the shovel. Dirt gave and settled with the damp, forgiving sound it makes after rain. I told myself these things happen. I didn't tell my wife. You learn early in parenthood what facts to keep and which to let pass through you like weather. Then the town started yawning in ways that looked like accidents. At the bus depot, Mr. Holloway slowed at the four-way stop and simply stayed. 10 hours later, he woke in the cab of his truck with the gear in neutral and the radio whispering ads for roofing and seed. At the library, Mrs. Coates stopped mid-sentence explaining the copier to a teenager and could not get back to the word button. At the feed store, J.D. wrapped twine around a bundle of steaks and his hands shook themselves into a blur. When I went to help, the heat coming off him felt like a fever without a disease. We said stress. We said the long summer. We said no one in this town sees a doctor unless something's already cracked. We didn't say each of them had posted pictures of a clinic child on their laps in the last month. Captions with too many exclamation points. Faces tilted toward the small brightness with the happy gravity of planets. June's preschool had 6 children from Aurelia's program. They ran like deer and rarely fell. If they did, they watched the scrape bead and close as if disappointed in the briefness of it. Parents swapped tips on protein snacks and sleep training and how to keep them from staring at people too long. We did not say staring, we said focusing. We did not say feeding, we said clingy. June liked to put her ear on me, on my chest, my throat, the soft underarm where pulse is loudest, and breathe very still. "I can hear your water," she said once, and the phrase made a deep old part of me sit up. The clinic invited us to a family health forum the last Saturday of August. White tent pitched on the rectangle of manicured grass beside their glass box lemonade in dispensers that looked like laboratory equipment. Paper cups that behaved like compost only if you believed the sign. June ran with the other kids in the sloping light. A pediatrician with a microphone spoke about metabolic coupling, a phrase she smoothed with her tongue until it almost sounded kind. She had a slide with 2 circles that overlapped. "Children are efficient," she said. "They exchange with their environment as part of thriving. Our protocol optimizes that coupling to ensure resilience." A mother raised her hand and asked about grandparents falling asleep in chairs and not waking until morning. The pediatrician smiled the way people do when they practice difficult answers in a mirror. "Vibrant children can be catalytic," she said. "We advise balance, rotate caregivers, ensure adequate nutrition, and rest for older adults. Above all, don't be afraid. Attachment is the pathway. Attachment stabilizes the exchange. The words attachment and stabilizes hung over us like the inside of a bell. When the talk ended, we clapped because everyone else did. June drank lemonade without blinking, then set the cup down with careful precision, as if the table might punish her for carelessness. That night, I pulled out the file box and laid the consent forms on the kitchen table under the yellow cone of the pendant lamp. I read slowly, as if catching the trick depended on not hurrying past it again. Novel trophic pathways, transient exchange states, environmental borrowing. Each term whitewashed by parentheses, temporary, self-limiting, community adaptive. In the margin, I wrote the words they were avoiding: takes, keeps, spreads. June woke before dawn and padded into our room like a thought. "Daddy," she whispered, and climbed between us. Her skin was cool. She set her small hand on my throat and left it there. Heat rose through my chest to meet her, a bloom that felt like the relief after a sprint ends, then settled into a calm so clean I wanted to apologize to every person I'd ever called calm, who was really only tired. When I woke again, the light was the flat gray of a day that hasn't decided who it will be. June was sitting up, watching us. My wife did not wake with me. Her breathing was steady, too steady, like a metronome someone forgot to switch off. I touched her shoulder. Nothing. Shook harder. Nothing. The ER doctor said stable enough times that I started to hate the word. Hypometabolic state. Profound fatigue, unresponsive, but reactive. They refused coma, and I refused nap. Machines whispered their ardent reassurances. The nurse warmed my wife's hands with a pack filled with gel. June sat in the chair by the window and looked at her mother with polite concentration, as if she were learning the shape of an instrument before she played it. I took June home to shower and change. The dog met us at the door, tail wagging too politely, then retreated to the far corner of the kitchen with a soft whine. June followed him, laid a hand on his side, and the sound stopped. He breathed in a slow, deliberate way that made me think of someone remembering a song verse by verse. I marched into Aurelia the next morning with sleep in my mouth and anger ringing like tinnitus. The receptionist blinked at me with perfect mascara. "I need to speak to someone who makes decisions," I said, and heard how easily the sentence fit into this building. A doctor I'd never met ushered me into an office where the same sunset photographs hung in different frames. Her hair looked expensive in a way that translates across state lines. She said my wife's name with professional softness, flipped through our file, and let me talk until my voice ran out of road. "Your daughter is exceptional," she said, as if we could be bribed with our own child. "Her intake is higher than projected. That can happen in the early phase." "Intake?" I repeated. As in exchange," she said quickly, brightening the word with a smile. "Children borrow, families adapt, communities adjust. This is the part where the pathway matures." "We are not a pathway," I said. "We are people." She folded her hands. "We advise limiting prolonged close contact with the immunocompromised and elderly for now. Rotate, diversify attachments. And remember, the children must attach. That is how the system learns to self-regulate." "Regulate what?" I asked. "Inflows," she said, and moved on so fast I almost didn't notice she'd said it. I signed a release for our records because the only thing I could control was paper. The printer exhaled pages that smelled like heat, and toner charts showed lines that went up and never dipped. Notes described behavioral proximity events in language so neutral it felt obscene. A summary read, "The cohort draws ambient vitality preferentially from familiar sources. Expected stabilization by month 30 with adequate distribution, preferentially. Familiar. Distribution." I took the stack and the words and finally understood what they had asked us to build with our love. A system the hospital called to say my wife's condition was unchanged. Unchanged had never sounded so much like a direction we were traveling in. I took June back to sit with her mother. June watched the monitor like a student tracking a lecture. "Mama is very quiet," she said. We stayed until the nurse reminded me to eat. On the way home, June asked if we could wave at the pond. "Tomorrow," I said, because my mouth needed an answer to give her. In the evening, I found June in the room that used to be the guest room, the room we'd called the nursery. Long before it had a reason, she had arranged her stuffed animals in a circle on the rug. Rabbit, turtle, soft brown bear, the dog with the felted ears that always flopped the wrong way, each face pointed inward. She knelt at the edge of the circle with her hands on her knees like a singer waiting for her cue. "What are you playing?" I asked. She didn't look up. "We play quiet," she said. "We say thank you." "What are you thanking?" I asked, and wished I could swallow the word back, because I already knew she considered the bear's button eyes. She listened to the center of the circle where nothing sat. "For the warm," she said, and smiled, a careful, practiced smile like the pediatricians, like the doctors in their sunset offices. The smile looked like something she had learned to do for us so we wouldn't be frightened. I sat down on the floor across from my daughter and her circle of pretend animals and felt the house tip a degree I thought of my father, who had started sleeping late and calling it a joke. I thought of Mr. Holloway in his truck, with the radio whispering roofing and seed. I thought of Mrs. Coates, hand hovering over the copier panel like a diviner's rod. The town had always been a place where we shared casseroles and lawnmowers and weather. We had not planned to share breath. That night, I dreamed of hearing my own heartbeat from the outside, as if I were standing in the hall listening to someone I loved sleep when I woke. June was there again, ear to my chest, palm cool against my sternum. My heart, obliging, slowed to meet her. It felt like giving and being relieved of something heavy. At once, I let it happen because I didn't know what else to do, and because the part of me that could say no was very tired. In the morning, the nurse on the cardiac floor said my wife was resting comfortably, the phrase hospitals keep in a drawer for when there is nothing else to hand you. I thanked her and hung up and watched June eat oatmeal with methodical care, each spoonful the same size, no mess, on the bib. When she finished, she looked at me with bright, glass-clear eyes that reflected more room than they should have. "Can we see Mama?" she asked. "We can," I said. "We'll bring flowers." "Flowers are sleepy," she said. "They don't mind." On the way out the door, I lifted the file box that held our life on paper, the consents, the lab printouts, the handouts with perfect children and perfect parks, and felt the weight of it settle into my arm. I realized then the box would only get heavier, and I would keep carrying it, because no one else could. In the yard, the dog lay with his head on his paws, watching us with a look that understood everything and could do nothing. June reached out her hand. He flinched and then held still, accepting the touch, his breath slowing until it matched hers, both of them listening for something in the air between them that I could not hear. By September, our town had learned new grammar. We stopped saying died. We said went still, because it left a small door open you could pretend might swing back. We stopped saying kids for the clinic children and started saying graduates, as if they had completed a course the rest of us could not pass. We never said experiment, because that word requires someone to admit they were running it. Obituaries thinned into notices. Name, age, passed peacefully at home. There were more of them, and they were shorter, like the town had grown tired of listing what people had loved. Dinners went uneaten and then stopped being cooked. The church ladies did not make casseroles because the ladies had gone still too. Faces arranged with that gentle surprise of people interrupted mid-thought. The florist set buckets of flowers outside with a sign that said, "Take what you need," and then locked her door and did not unlock it again. The sheriff's deputy, young and newly promoted because the sheriff had retired to his recliner and never stood from it, tried to start a caravan out. He announced it on the community Facebook page. County Exodus, meet at dawn, bring water, gas up, no pets, and then printed flyers, because the older folks weren't on Facebook anymore, just as absent as if they deleted their accounts. He lined us up on Main Street, trucks and sedans and a couple of rusted RVs, engines idling like a choir afraid of the first note. We had coolers and bungee cords and lists that made us feel like we were doing something. June sat in the back seat with her hands folded as if she were going to church and not leaving her life. We didn't make it past the stoplight at the clinic. Engines sputtered and fell into a low, stubborn rhythm and then quit, one by one, like they had all arrived at the same opinion. The deputy's face went empty at the same rate as the dashboard lights. He turned the key. He patted the steering wheel. He stared at the clinic's mirrored windows and saw himself small and unimportant in every pane. He climbed out, closed his door carefully, and walked home. The way you walk when you remember a chore you forgot to finish. Why? I asked, because some part of me still believed asking had power. June watched the building, patient. "It's loud," she said. "It's telling them to hush." We drove home with the windows down to fool the car into feeling less trapped. I packed a bag even though the caravan had failed. Passports, cash, photos, in case paper magic still meant anything. I called the hospital resting comfortably, the nurse said, a phrase that now felt like a threat and a wish. I asked to put the phone by my wife's ear. "She can hear you," the nurse lied. I said her name 6 times. I tried to find a story that ended with her waking and couldn't. People started taping notes to their front doors. "Not home. Do not enter. Child inside." The notes were less warning than plea. The mail kept coming because the Postal Service answered to laws older than this. Envelopes nestled in boxes with dog biscuits the carrier still left because he had promised he would. I walked to the end of our drive and saw him at a distance, moving slowly, shoulders rounded as if someone had draped a wet quilt over him. When he saw me, he lifted his hand and then set it down before the wave finished being born. I told June we were going to see the mountains. I said it like an adventure so she would think to bring a jacket. She put on her shoes without looking down. She asked if we could stop by the pond to wave at the frogs. "They're sleepy," she said. "They'll forget we waved if we don't." "We'll see them another time," I said, lying to her and to time. We left before dawn because leaving in the dark makes you feel braver. Half the town was already on the road. Cars pointed toward the highway like iron filings toward a magnet. The clinic's white tent was down. The rectangle of grass it had hidden was leached into a paler green, like a healed burn. We reached County Road 9 and saw them. The children standing in the ditches and along the culverts, in pairs and trios and small clusters, hands linked when they could be, heads tilted like birds listening for worms. Their faces were simple and composed, the way faces are when someone tells you to hold still for a photo. June shifted in her seat. "Friends," she said, and smiled, a real smile that cracked something bright inside me. "Eyes on me," I said. My voice went hoarse around the words. "They're hungry," she said, like she was telling me there would be rain. I tried to reverse. The engine grumbled and then made a small sound that was not exactly surrender and not exactly apology. The dashboard blinked its icons all at once and then went as quiet as a pond in heat. I opened June's door and unbuckled her. She weighed less than she should have, like the idea of her was heavier than her body. The children watched us without impatience. They weren't hunting. They weren't tricking us. They simply were. A boy I recognized from preschool, perfect hair, neatly buttoned shirt as if someone still ironed even now, stepped forward and held out his hand. "Please," he said, and meant it. June leaned toward him. I pulled her close. Her ear pressed against my ribs and the muscle under her went to work smoothing me. The pressure in the air deepened, a tide moving in with no water involved. It wasn't temperature, it wasn't wind, it was the feeling of being agreed upon by something larger than you. "We share," June said into my shirt. "It's only a little." My wife's face rose in my mind like a coin brought up from a well. The last morning, her expression not pained, not afraid, simply absent in a way that felt polite. My father's voice from the week before, sapped, not bad, just more than I felt. The squirrel under the pecan tree, the neatness of its ending. The librarian's hand hovering over a button she would not press. The paper from Aurelia, preferentially from familiar sources. My chest hurt in a way that wasn't pain, yet I set June down because there was a moment when love becomes a door and you're the one holding it open or standing in the frame. She took my hand, squeezed. "Thank you, Daddy," she said, and there was that catch again, the practiced word that would someday be smooth. "I love you," I said. The words felt like bricks laid carefully in cold weather. I wanted to stack them higher, make a wall we could crouch behind. All I managed was the arrangement I have always known. "I love you." "We love you too," said the boy with the perfect part, and the "we" landed in me like a small stone dropped down a deep pipe. The leaning increased. I remember the smell of ditch grass, damp and clean. I remember the sound of a red-winged blackbird making his two-note announcement from the fence like stated fact. I remember that it did not hurt. People will tell you that horror needs pain, but this was not horror. It was accounting. It was the town balancing a ledger, transferring energy from one column to another with the calm of someone who has done this task a long time. My knees gave. I lowered myself because falling felt impolite around children. The kids did not swarm. They stood where they were and watched and breathed. June counted under her breath. 1, 2, 3, as if keeping time for a game we'd invented together. My breath matched hers, and in matching grew shallower. My thoughts thinned until only one remained. Keep your eyes on her face. If all I could do for my daughter was witness the shape she made in the world, I would do it. Almost, June said, and the word was kind. I wanted to say her name once more the way I said it in the hospital when she was new and furious at the brightness of the world June. I wanted to tell her to be gentle with sleepy frogs and with old men, to say thank you when she took the warm, to choose shade in August and water over soda, and to carry a sweater because air conditioning is a liar. I managed the J of her name, the soft start of it, and then the rest fell away from me like a shirt unbuttoned and shrugged out of and dropped to a floor that would never need sweeping again. I came back the way you sometimes surface from a very shallow sleep. No gasping, just an awareness that time had moved without you. The sky had shifted, the light was flatter. The children were still there, but the line of cars on the road was gone, doors closed as if everyone had left politely, locking behind them. Houses farther off had their front doors open like mouths that had finished a story and were resting. The power lines hummed over a town that would never require much of them again. Time to go, a girl said. She was missing her front teeth. She smiled around the absence like it was nothing to be ashamed of. The children turned in unison the way a flock does when it changes its mind. Without argument, June looked back and lifted her hand in a wave, the way you wave to a neighbor you will see tomorrow. For a second, she looked like she had the first day I met her, bundled and outraged and perfect, and then she looked like she had last week, at the clinic's tent, when she drank lemonade and placed the cup down with precision. And then she looked like something I did not have a word for because it did not need me to name it. I tried to stand and could not. My legs knew the choreography, but the music had changed. I rolled to my side and propped myself on an elbow and watched them walk toward town, small backs straight, hands finding hands without searching. A wind went through the pecans, and the leaves flipped their pale bellies as if asking for rain. Somewhere, a screen door clapped and did not clap again. By noon, the square was a clean diagram. The dry fountain, the war memorial with its names, the benches with their metal armrests designed to discourage sleeping, the ring of children holding hands like spokes. They smiled, not with delight and not with cruelty, but with the careful, taught kindness of those who have been told to reassure. If there had been a camera, they would have held the smile until the click. There was no camera. They held it anyway. I walked slowly, carrying my weight like water in a cracked bucket, back along County Road 9 toward Main Street, because moving felt like a promise that I could still make. The notes on the doors flapped once and then rested. In the clinic parking lot, a single receipt cartwheeled and then lay down. The clinic's windows reflected sky and small versions of me and the children in a way that suggested everything could be contained and cataloged if you had enough panes of glass. At the hospital, the doors stood open and the lights worked because hospitals keep their own kind of time. The nurse's station hummed gently to itself. I walked the corridor to my wife's room. The bed was made the way beds are made in places where you owe money. The call button had been placed neatly over the rail. Someone had set a small vase of flowers on the sill. They were sleepy, like June had said. On the bedside table lay a bracelet with my wife's name and a plastic cup with a line at 8 ounces and the indentation of someone's thumb. I sat in the chair by the window where June had sat and tried to remember if we had said goodbye, and then realized that in our town, goodbyes were not part of the grammar anymore, only pauses I went home because the dog would need to be let out even if the end of the world was underway. He came to the door and lay down at my feet and rested his head on my shoe. He was breathing, slow and obedient. I filled his bowl. He did not eat. He watched me like I was a place he knew well that had shifted an inch to the left. I walked room to room, touching the edges of things so I could see if they were still where they belonged. The circle of stuffed animals in the nursery was still arranged with their faces turned inward. I knelt and put my hand in the center of the circle the way June had not, because she had known not to. The carpet was warm, the kind of warm that stays when bodies have left. Evening came. It arrived the way it always does here, a smudging of the edges, crickets trying out their tuning forks, the air growing patient. I went to the square because I did not know where else to put my body. The children had changed position, or maybe I had. They stood in small groups now, heads together, not whispering but resting. Every so often, one would lift a hand and someone else would lift theirs and the air would adjust. They were, to the eye, beautiful. I thought of the Family Health Forum and the woman with the microphone, how she had said, above all, don't be afraid. And I realized she hadn't been warning us. She had been asking for permission. Don't be afraid, let this happen. Let the system learn. June, I said, and she turned, and I understood there are names you can keep saying even when the person who wears them doesn't need you to anymore. She walked to me, unlinked her hand from the girl beside her, and stood at a distance that preserved both of us. Up close, her eyes were so bright the color had burned out of them. She smiled the careful smile. It was steadier now. She was getting better. Daddy, she said. She didn't put her ear to my chest. She didn't touch my throat. She looked at my face the way you look at a photograph you are about to put in a box for safekeeping. Thank you, she said, and there was no catch. For what? I asked, because habits are the last to go. For everything, she said, and I believed her. I walked home in the dark because I wanted to arrive somewhere while the world still knew how to hold. Night I lay on our bed and faced the space where my wife would have been and placed my hand where June's had been the night before. The house listened. The house held the temperature of someone who had just left a room. In the distance, I heard the hum of the substation and imagined the lines slackening one by one until the grid understood none of this was required anymore. At dawn, I went back to the square and found what I had known I would. The town empty of motion, doors open to air, dogs lying with their heads on their paws, birds making tidy work of insects above the grass. The children stood like a ring around a small, invisible fire only they could see. They smiled, not for me and not for any camera, but because someone had taught them that smiling was what you did when people looked, I thought, stupidly and exactly, of the first time I saw June's embryo on the screen. Those perfect bubbles. The doctor saying textbook. The room full of white and promise. I thought of the consent form and the parentheses that softened everything sharp. I thought of the word miracle and how eagerness can make you accept the exchange rate without reading the fine print. The sun lifted. It touched mailboxes and the clinic's sterile grass and the plaque on the war memorial and the top of June's head. It warmed the square with no one to thank it and no one to hide from it. It warmed my face. The air was so clear you could hear a truck on the highway 2 towns over still moving because not everywhere in America had chosen our bargain. Yet I sat on the bench and waited for a sound that would tell me what to do next. The children did not move. They did not need to. They had all the time they required. We had given it to them. When the clock on the courthouse tolled noon, the bell sounded thinner than it used to, a little lost without traffic to ring over. The 12th strike hung in the air and then faded. The square didn't change. My breath did. I counted its steps like someone walking down a long hallway toward a door you can't see. I held my daughter in my eyes the whole way, the shape of her, the steadiness of her gaze, the way her hand had felt in mine when the road turned into a river we were not meant to cross. I closed my eyes because there was nothing left to keep open for. Somewhere very close, a child laughed once, softly, like a bell tapped with a fingertip. The sound of a town exhaling for the last time is not a roar. It is the quiet after. And in that quiet, the children smiled.